Let me tell you something that most people won't hear until it's too late. The Social Security Administration just implemented a policy shift this February that fundamentally changes how they can enforce compliance. And frankly, it's one of those situations where ignorance costs you everything. For decades, the system operated on a relatively predictable framework. You qualified, you received your benefits, and outside of criminal convictions or specific fraud cases, your check remained intact. But what we're seeing now represents a dramatic expansion of SSA's enforcement authority. Under the new February 2026 protocols, the administration can now suspend your entire monthly payment, not reduce it, not delay it temporarily, but stop it completely for violations that previously would have triggered warnings or minor adjustments. The trigger mechanisms are what concern me most. Unreported income above minimal thresholds, failure to report changes in living arrangements, even administrative discrepancies in your file that you might not know exist. Any of these can now result in full payment suspension while they investigate. And here's the part that should worry every recipient. The burden of proof has shifted. You're now required to demonstrate compliance rather than them having to prove violation. Now, I've spent considerable time studying how institutions evolve their enforcement mechanisms, and what we're witnessing with this February 2026 rule change follows a pattern that anyone who's paid attention to bureaucratic systems should recognize. The Social Security Administration didn't wake up one morning and decide to get tougher on beneficiaries out of malice. No, this stems from a combination of budgetary pressures, technological capabilities they didn't possess before, and frankly, decades of what they perceive as systemic abuse that cost the trust fund billions. But here's where it gets interesting for you as a recipient. Understanding their motivations doesn't protect you unless you understand the specific mechanisms they're now employing. Let me walk you through what's actually changed at the operational level, because the devil is absolutely in the details here. Previously, when the SSA detected a potential issue with your account, let's say you failed to report that you'd gone back to work part-time, or that your living situation changed when your daughter moved in to help care for you, they would typically send you a letter. You'd have time to respond, provide documentation, and while they might adjust your future payments, your current check usually kept coming while they sorted things out. That buffer, that grace period, was built into the system almost by default. It wasn't codified as a right, but it was standard operating procedure born out of practical necessity and a recognition that many beneficiaries are elderly, some are cognitively impaired, and administrative errors happen on both sides. What's fundamentally different now is that the SSA has integrated what they call real-time verification protocols with immediate suspension authority. They've connected their systems to IRS databases, state employment records, financial institutions, and even utility companies in ways that simply weren't possible 10 years ago. When these systems detect a discrepancy, and I want to emphasize that word, discrepancy, not proof of wrongdoing, they can trigger an automatic hold on your payment. The check you're expecting on the 3rd of the month simply doesn't arrive, and you receive a notice that your benefits are suspended pending investigation. Now you're in a position where you need to prove everything is in order, and you're doing it without the income you depend on for rent, medications, and food. The categories of violations that can trigger this immediate suspension have expanded in ways that concern me deeply. Let's take unreported income as the most obvious example. If you're receiving Social Security retirement benefits before your full retirement age and you're still working, there are earnings limits. For 2026, if you earn more than $18,960 annually, they reduce your benefits. That's been true for years. What's new is the enforcement mechanism and the threshold for what they consider unreported. In the past, this would get reconciled when you filed your taxes, and they'd adjust the following year's benefits accordingly. Now, if their systems detect income from an employer, maybe you picked up a seasonal job at a local hardware store, or you're doing some consulting work and the client reported it as contractor income, and you haven't proactively notified SSA within 30 days, they can suspend your entire check immediately. But here's where it gets more complicated, and this is what keeps me up at night thinking about how many people are going to get caught completely unaware. The SSA's definition of reportable changes has expanded to include things that most people would never think to report. If you move from living alone to living with your adult child, that's a reportable change because it potentially affects whether you're paying your fair share of household expenses, which factors into SSI calculations and can affect certain benefit determinations. If you get married, obviously that's reportable. If you get divorced, reportable. If a spouse dies, reportable. But now they're also looking at changes in your bank accounts. If you suddenly have a deposit that's larger than your normal pattern, maybe you sold a car or a relative gave you money for a medical expense, or you inherited a small amount from a deceased friend, their systems can flag that as unreported income or a change in resources. I've studied enough institutional behavior to know that when an agency gets new technological tools, they tend to use them aggressively at first, and it takes years of pushback and refinement before they settle into reasonable application. We're in that aggressive phase right now. The SSA is under tremendous pressure from Congress to reduce improper payments. There's been report after report showing that billions of dollars are paid out annually to people who shouldn't be receiving them or who should be receiving different amounts. The political pressure to do something about this is enormous, and the something they've chosen to do is implement these automated enforcement systems with hair-trigger suspension authority. Now let me explain something about the reinstatement process, because this is where the real harm occurs for people who've done nothing wrong or who made innocent mistakes. Once your benefits are suspended under these new protocols, you're not just dealing with SSA anymore. You're dealing with multiple verification departments, and each one operates on its own timeline. Let's say you need to prove that the $5,000 that appeared in your bank account was a gift from your son to help with a new roof, not income. You'll need a signed statement from your son. You might need to show the contract with the roofing company. You might need bank statements showing the money went directly to that expense. Gathering this documentation takes time, especially if you're elderly and not particularly comfortable with computers, scanning, and uploading documents to their portal. Meanwhile, you're not receiving your benefits. If your monthly Social Security check is $1,500 and this process takes 2 months to resolve, which is actually faster than average from what I'm seeing in early cases, you're out $3,000 in income during that period. Sure, they'll reinstate you and you'll eventually get that money in a retroactive payment, but what are you supposed to do for rent this month? How do you pay for your prescriptions? The practical impact of this policy on people living paycheck to paycheck, which describes the majority of Social Security recipients, is devastating. There's another aspect of this that deserves serious attention, and that's the appeals process. Under the previous system, if SSA made a determination you disagreed with, you could request reconsideration while your benefits continued. You had the right to appeal through multiple levels: reconsideration, administrative law judge hearing, appeals council, and potentially federal court. At each stage, your benefits typically continued unless there was a finding of fraud. The new rules have changed this calculation significantly. Now, the suspension happens immediately, and you're appealing from a position of having no income rather than from a position of defending your current payment level. This fundamentally changes the leverage in the relationship between the beneficiary and the agency. I want to talk about the specific populations who are most vulnerable under this new regime, because vulnerability comes in different forms, and understanding your particular risk profile is essential to protecting yourself. First, you have people receiving supplemental security income, which is the needs-based program for elderly and disabled individuals with limited income and resources. SSI has always had strict resource limits. Currently $2,000 for an individual, $3,000 for a couple. These limits haven't increased meaningfully in decades, which is a scandal in itself, but that's a different conversation. Under the new enforcement protocols, SSI recipients are subject to monthly automated verification of bank accounts and resources. If their system detects that you exceeded the resource limit even temporarily, maybe your account balance was $2,100 on the day they checked because you hadn't paid your rent yet that month, that can trigger an immediate suspension. Then you have early retirees who took benefits at 62 or later, but before their full retirement age and are still doing some work. These folks are navigating the earnings limit I mentioned earlier, and the margin for error is razor thin. The annual exempt amount for 2026 is $18,960, which works out to $1,580 per month. If you go over that in any given month, even if you're under for the year overall, their monitoring system might flag it. The old system would reconcile this annually. The new system can suspend immediately and ask questions later. Another vulnerable group is people receiving benefits based on disability. Disability beneficiaries are subject to continuing disability reviews to ensure they still meet the medical criteria. They're also subject to substantial gainful activity limits if they try to return to work. The new enforcement mechanisms apply here too, but with an additional wrinkle. If you're on disability and you start doing any kind of work, even volunteer work in some cases, and don't report it properly through their designated channels, they can suspend your entire benefit. I've already seen cases where someone with a disability started volunteering at their church. The church gave them a small honorarium that they reported as contractor income to the IRS. And SSA's systems flagged it as unreported work activity that potentially invalidates their disability status. Let me address something that I think is crucial for people to understand about how to protect themselves in this new environment. The fundamental principle you need to operate under is this: over-communicate everything to Social Security, document that you've communicated it, and keep your own records of every interaction. This is burdensome, it shouldn't be necessary, but it absolutely is necessary under the current regime. If anything changes in your life that could conceivably affect your benefits, report it. If you're not sure whether it's reportable, report it anyway. The worst that happens if you over-report is they tell you it wasn't necessary. The worst that happens if you under-report is they suspend your check and you spend months trying to get it reinstated. Here's my recommended protocol, developed from studying what's actually working for people who are successfully navigating this system. First, create a Social Security binder or folder, physical or digital, where you keep everything related to your benefits. Every award letter, every notice, every piece of correspondence. Second, anytime you report something to Social Security, do it in writing through their online portal if possible, or by certified mail if you're doing it on paper. Phone calls are not sufficient because there's no documentation trail that you can control. When you use their online system, take screenshots showing that you submitted the information and when. If you mail something, keep the certified mail receipt. Third, maintain your own records of anything that might be relevant to your benefits. Keep pay stubs if you're working. Keep bank statements. Keep documentation of major transactions, gifts received, inheritances, anything that affects your financial situation. The fourth element of protection is probably the most important and the most overlooked. Understand what triggers the automated systems and structure your financial life to avoid those triggers when possible. For example, if you're an SSI recipient close to the resource limit, don't keep large balances in your checking account. Pay your bills as soon as money comes in. If someone wants to give you a financial gift, have them pay the expense directly instead of giving you money that passes through your account. If you need to sell an asset, understand that the proceeds will show up as a resource and plan for how you'll spend down to the allowable limit within the permitted time frame. These aren't tricks to cheat the system. These are ways to structure your affairs so that you remain in compliance while minimizing the risk that an automated system misinterprets your situation. Now, I need to address what happens if you do get suspended, because for some people reading this, it's already happened or it's going to happen despite your best efforts. The first 72 hours after suspension are critical. As soon as you receive notice that your benefits are suspended, you need to take action immediately. Log into your Social Security account online or call them and find out specifically what triggered the suspension. Don't accept vague answers. You need to know exactly what discrepancy or issue they've identified. Once you know what it is, gather your documentation to address that specific issue. If they say you had unreported income, get your tax returns, your pay stubs, documentation showing what that income actually was and that you did report it or that it was below the reporting threshold. If they say you exceeded resource limits, get your bank statements showing your actual balances and documentation explaining any unusual deposits. Submit this documentation immediately through their preferred channel and request an expedited review based on financial hardship. Most people don't know this, but SSA does have provisions for expediting reinstatement in cases where the suspension creates severe financial hardship. You need to specifically request this and document your hardship. If you're facing eviction, get a notice from your landlord. If you can't afford medications, get a statement from your pharmacy showing your prescriptions and costs. Make it concrete and specific. While you're waiting for reinstatement, contact local social service agencies, area agency on aging, legal aid organizations that specialize in Social Security issues. Many communities have emergency assistance programs specifically designed to help people who are between benefits. Let me talk about the legal landscape around this because there are already challenges working their way through the courts, and understanding the legal framework helps you understand what rights you actually have. The Social Security Act does give SSA broad authority to verify eligibility and recover overpayments. Courts have generally upheld their right to suspend benefits when there's a question about ongoing eligibility. However, there are due process requirements that SSA must follow. They have to give you notice. They have to give you an opportunity to be heard. They have to make decisions based on substantial evidence. The problem is that these procedural protections are worth very little if you can't afford rent while you're exercising them. There are several legal aid organizations that have filed class action suits challenging aspects of the new enforcement protocols, particularly around the immediacy of suspension without adequate pre-suspension notice and opportunity to respond. These cases argue that suspending benefits based on automated system flags without human review violates due process. They argue that the burden shifting, where you have to prove compliance rather than them having to prove violation, is unconstitutional. These are important cases, and they may eventually result in modifications to how SSA implements these policies. But litigation takes years, and in the meantime, you need to protect yourself under the rules as they currently exist. I want to close this section with something that I think is important for people to understand about the broader context of what's happening here. Social Security is facing a long-term funding challenge. The trust fund is projected to be depleted by the early 2030s if nothing changes. This creates enormous political pressure to reduce expenditures wherever possible. Aggressive enforcement that reduces improper payments is politically easier than raising taxes or cutting benefits across the board. So from the agency's perspective, they're doing what they've been directed to do by Congress and what they believe is necessary to preserve the program long term. I understand that logic, but the implementation of these enforcement mechanisms is causing real harm to real people, many of whom are completely innocent of any wrongdoing and are simply caught up in an automated system that lacks nuance and human judgment. This tension between program integrity and individual fairness is something we need to grapple with as a society, but in the meantime, you need to know how to navigate the system as it actually exists today.